quality of a Fire Emblem map can be separated into 5 different factors. Flavor, how well the map matches the story and atmosphere that it is trying to portray, and whether or not it succeeds at making you feel like you're really experiencing the story as the developers intended. Objective, what the map is asking you to do in order to finish the chapter, be it seizing, routing, escaping, or defending. Is it offering you an objective that is interesting to work towards? Replayability, you finished the chapter, now how do you feel about it? Frustrated? Relieved? Satisfied? There's any number of possible outcomes that can occur after finishing a chapter, so consider whether or not you'd enjoy playing the chapter again on a subsequent playthrough. Difficulty. Difficulty might not be an important factor for everyone, but a fair amount of players yearn to be challenged by Fire Emblem, to be given a puzzle to solve with the resources provided. Was the map that you just finished difficult in a compelling way? Enjoyability. Plain and simple, is the map fun to play? Are you having a good time whilst playing it, and if so, are you able to articulate exactly why the map is so stimulating? When all of these variables are managed effectively, what you're left with is an incredibly satisfying chapter to play through, providing a memorable experience for the player that they'll hopefully be excited to enjoy again during a second playthrough. And if you don't pay attention to this formula, what you're given is some of the worst the series has to offer. My name's Blute. Welcome to F.O.R.D.E. And welcome back to another episode of F.O.R.D.E. This time tackling FE6, everyone's favorite little red-headed stepchild of a Fire Emblem game. Oh man, FE6. I know I say this pretty regularly, but FE6 is kind of an awkward game that I like thinking about playing FE6, but every time I actually play FE6, it's just like, oh god, it's like playing through cement. It's just not particularly enjoyable. I think my opinion of it has probably soured over time. That being said, the chapter that we'll be talking about today is... I mean, it's not... I'd say it's one of the better ones. It's not one of the more memorable ones. I'm just gonna go ahead and say this is an underrated map, in my opinion. But, as for which chapter it is, did you manage to solve my wacky anagram of Fencer's Pro Bins? As, believe it or not, it turns into Princess of Bern, Chapter 2 of Binding Blade. Now, when we're talking about an early game chapter, it's going to be a little bit, trickier to talk about on average, I'd say, because while I would like this to be a slightly shorter one, there's still, a lot to dissect from early game chapters, more so than you'd think. There's a lot of stuff in early game chapters that is actually really, really important to get down pat. You need to do it really, really effectively if you want a fun and enjoyable and memorable early game. But instead of just diving into that, let's just go right to the categories. Starting with F, Flavor. Flavor's kind of peculiar on this one, because since it's so early on in the game, and, it's Binding Blade, it's kind of bland in terms of story beats. There's not a whole lot going on. The general premise for the chapter is the enemy is chasing Ellen as they've got Guinevere captured and they want to, keep her hostage for their own personal gain and some such. And then they spot Ellen taking refuge with Roy's army, and the rest of the chapter is Roy saying, you know what, we should run at them and kill them all. That works, and then the chapter just sort of ends. FE6 is a masterful story, just, don't ask anyone what happens in it. Now, I understand what they were going for, but I'm not entirely sure that it works very well. I think I get what they were going for. The idea was to have a couple of soldiers towards the beginning of the map to act as scouts, with the main, large squad of enemies on the right towards the castle, lagging behind, as in the story, they're, kind of panicked by Ellen's disappearance. This makes sense. It also means the main thread of the map is that big old, pod of fighters and soldiers and that single mercenary, I believe. I want to say there's, one archer as well. This is the main thread of the map, and they are way off in the distance, while the starting soldiers are just fodder. This setup is really, really simple, and I like the idea of it. I like the idea of having scouting soldiers, and there are maps in the series that have done this far more effectively, the Stealth chapter in FE9, Chapter 10, just right off the top of my head. And while it isn't terribly done here, it's certainly not very effective either, as I think the massive gap between the two groups of enemies just makes them feel very disconnected. As due to Deke Squad showing up from turn 2 onwards, it's basically impossible for these two squads of enemies to even meet, which kind of just eliminates the looming feeling of the enemies quickly overwhelming you, potentially. It just makes it feel like you're fighting two different armies, so to say. Now, off the top of my head, you could probably, improve this really, really easily by just making those starting soldiers, less suicidal. Instead of having them charge directly onto Marcus's lance, have them retreat towards the forts on the right, and maybe have a quip from them about how, if they make it to the forts, they'll be able to sound the alarm. and this would trigger reinforcements. This would both give the enemy something meaningful to do, as well as introduce the player to the possibility of reinforcements, which could be viewed as a little bit complex for something to do as early as Chapter 2, but I don't know, it's early game. I think you're supposed to, like, introduce the player to mechanics, which we'll get into more with the objective. Regardless, I'm gonna go ahead and say that it actually does fail on flavor, amazingly so. We've finally reached a map that I don't think succeeds on flavor, because I think the main purpose of the map, or what they were going for, was to try and make the player feel like they're going to get swarmed if they don't capture the terrain available, which doesn't really work, as I've said, just because the two enemy armies, they're just too separate. It doesn't really work. Sorry, no flavor this time. That's a pass from me. Moving on to objective, and this is where the chapter gets really interesting to me, because me personally, I find early game maps in FE to be really, really interesting. Maybe, like, the most interesting part of the game for me. I think mid-game can become kind of samey in a lot of games, and late game can feel really, like, bipolar in terms of quality. Like, some games have really, really good late game, and others have really forgettable ones, because it's really, really difficult to balance around late game. But early game, for me, is always intriguing, because it's where you have to teach potentially new players about mechanics. Regardless of which game it is, there is always the possibility that this Fire Emblem is someone's very first Fire Emblem. So it doesn't matter how many times you've had similar tutorials at this point, you gotta teach them about the weapon triangle, and terrain, and reinforcements, and unit types, and blah 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 blah. And I actually think this is where the chapter excels, through its very simple but effective lessons. I should also establish that FE6 is entirely C's, so there isn't really like a whole lot to talk about there. In the case of this chapter, I'd say, yeah, it does fit, since you're trying to rescue Guinevere and actually capture the castle, and there's enough obstacles in the way to make it meaningful, so it does work in that regard, but it's not really the point of this chapter, so to say. Chapter 1 is very, very light in terms of introducing mechanics to the player. I think it basically just introduces weapon triangle and ranged weaponry like bows and javelins, and that's kind of it. But when you get to Chapter 2, they attempt to inform the player on so many different things, like effective weaponry, and the importance of forts, and what enemy types are going to be dangerous, and tons of different other things. To varying levels of success, I should say. They're not all done, like, equally well. But one thing I think it does really, really well is demonstrating just how impactful terrain can be for the player, with the positioning of the forts. It's really simple, but by having that potential fight for the fort on the left, the player will learn that the extra defensive stats can be really important for units who are trying to hold down a position. Same with the forts on the right, although without much of a fight, meaning that if the players fail to claim the fort on the left, they'll learn about forts the hard way on the left, whilst the ones on the right are far more forgiving, almost acting as like a consolation prize in a way. It's genuinely really, really effective for teaching the player with potentially rewarding gameplay while not restricting the experience entirely by basically just giving you the forts on the right for free. It's really good, like genuinely great stuff, double thumbs up. It's good. Unfortunately, it's not all positive, as something like effective weaponry really isn't shown very well. Princess of Bern marks the first appearance of armor slayers and hammers, as well as introducing your first flyer with Shana. For Shana, there's a single archer in that big old pool of enemies on the right, filled with soldiers and mercenary, or a single mercenary and fighters, but there's also that single archer that just pretty much exists to glare at Shana throughout the entire map. It's literally just there to make sure that Shana isn't doing very much on Chapter 2, which is kind of fine, but I think that's kind of done effectively to show you, like, ooh, archers are very dangerous with flyers, keep them away, the end times. But when you get to the armor effective weapons, your armor slayers and hammers, there's literally only a single armor knight on the entire map, so same number of troops as the archer. It's the boss, and he's going to be holding down a fucking FE6 throne. So yeah, have fun trying to hit him with a 45 hit hammer. Like, I want to say Ward on average, or even like Lot with slightly high. I think Lot has slightly higher skill, I could be wrong. Either way, I think they're both going to be averaging around like maybe 25 to 30 hit against that dude, and they will have less hit than him, despite the fact that they have weapon triangle disadvantage. This is an awful tutorial for hammers. You want to have your first introduction to effective weaponry be like, whoa, this weapon's so powerful! Gotta bring in the hammer and like the armor slayer and like heavy spears that don't exist in FE6. Like, into chapters with a bunch of armor knights, so they can be really, really effective. Here, it's bad, because you're effectively given a false lesson, which is that if you try to use this weapon, you're going to miss. I could talk about this stuff for ages and ages, so I'll just shorten this. I do think it succeeds on objective overall, as I think its main goal is to teach newer players about all these new mechanics, and while not all of them are as done as, like, effectively as the forts, I'd say overall there's more pluses than minuses, so to say. Like, it does a good introduction for introducing unit types both for the player and the enemy, introducing mercenaries and Pegasus Knights and fighters. Well, you've seen fighters at this point, but like playable fighters and like Merlinus and your first healer. Like, it does a really good job of introducing all these new unit types. Really just genuinely great stuff. A lot of the stuff, like, really goes under the radar. You kind of just take it for granted, but if you don't do an effective job of gradually easing your player into the pool of mechanics, so to say, it can feel very overwhelming when you reach, like, your first mid-game chapter of, like, chapter 8 or 9, and, like, oh, I hope you learned all the mechanics, because if you didn't, we're gonna be throwing them at you, like, fucking lock, stock, and barrel. Fucking buckle up, chucklehead. So by having the player gradually learn them through the early chapters, it makes them, like, more experienced once they get to the mid-game. And it's done really effectively here. Objective is a success. Now, for replayability, yeah, this one isn't complicated. This one's a big old fail, we don't need to talk about this for very long. It's an early game map, so it's already going to be hyper-restricted in the amount of customization you can have at this point. This paired with the fact that you are just going to be making choke points on the left and the right, makes for an incredibly samey map. And it's not really the chapter's fault, per se, as trying to make your chapter 2 be wildly different each time you play it would be an incredibly impressive feat, and I almost wouldn't want that now that I'm really thinking about it. I feel like on average, people want comfort rather than excitement for the early game. As I said, it's better to ease your player in than potentially scare them away with, like, super wild gameplay. Either way, I think we're just gonna go ahead and leave it there for replayability. It's really, really simple. It's an early game chapter. There is not a whole lot to talk about with, like, variation and versatility. It's very much just do the thing as the teacher tells you to, and then the chapter just kind of ends. Now for the difficulty, this one's also kind of a weird one. FE6's difficulty is kind of infamous at this point for being... There's really no other way to put it, it's just all over the fucking place. If you look at a difficulty curve for your average Fire Emblem, I'd say it'd either be the traditional, like, upward slope of gradually getting harder as the game goes along, or like a bell curve positioned upwards, so to say, like a big N rather than a U. Whereas Binding Blade... Oh, good fucking heavens. Alright, the hardest parts of Binding Blade are the early game, since they kind of just forgot to scale the early game enemies correctly, or they're bugged or something. They're just not, like, scaled correctly on hard mode, which makes them far too strong for this point of the game. There's a bunch of, like, weirdly tough enemies in early game, like nomads and calves and mercenaries are all incredibly strong when you fight them. It makes for a really, really tough set of early chapters, which I will say, fortunately, out of all of the first 7-ish maps, I'd say this one is the most forgiving. I'd say this one suffers the least from this, like, massive early game difficulty spike, due to its simple structure, since there really isn't that much room for, like, really difficult fighting encounters when you're blessed with... You're basically just given forts for free, which is effectively just 20 free avoid and 1 free defense for whoever's holding them down. And this paired with FE6 hit rates should make it so you're actually able to, like, kind of avoid this, like, glut of really strong enemies. And for the most part, Chapter 2 has, like, generally weak enemy types, like fighters and soldiers aren't that strong. And you also get, like, Deke and Shana having their first appearance, 2 very, very strong units. Like, your initial squad of units is, like, Marcus and the Cavs as strong units, and then you have 3 Goobers with Roy, Walt, and Boars. Whereas Deke and Shana are, like, legitimately strong units. And Ward and Lot aren't that bad either. So instead of feeling like you're going against these juggernauts that are just, like, wearing a soldier's cap or a mercenary's headband, it feels more like the chapter should be, and that there's, like, a couple of dangerous enemies here and there. Like the previously mentioned single mercenary, keep an eye out for him, that fucker's dangerous. And the archer preventing Shana from being allowed to participate in the map. She has to sit on the non-existent bench at this point and just kind of watch while everyone else has fun. But otherwise, the enemies are generally at the power level that they should normally be at. Yeah, Binding Blade can be pretty obnoxious with its difficulty a lot of the time, so I think it's actually kind of pleasant to be able to say that this chapter manages to escape that for the most part. I'm gonna say it passes on difficulty, as it feels like a fair chapter among an otherwise really notorious early game. Genuinely, I think Chapter 2's difficulty is, like, reasonable. There's threats, but there's not too many threats for an early game. It's quite nice. Now for our final category, Enjoyability. I've been umming and ahhing about this one, much like difficulty, although difficulty was earing towards pass. I feel like this one is... FE6 is kind of, like, I mentioned this at the start, FE6 is kind of contentious when it comes to actually enjoying the game, as... Like, legit, I find that above all other games in the series, other than the ones I haven't finished, and, you know, El Diablo, then the one who shall not be named, 3 houses, I probably have the least fun playing Binding Blade. It's definitely, like, the GBA game that I have the least fun playing, despite the fact that I actually prefer it over FE7. This series is fucking jarring. Yeah, I still like it overall as a game, for some reason. And when it comes to this chapter, there is something very comforting about choking those points and watching all of the enemies have to go through the great malaise of FE6 hit rates. But at the same time, you could also just view that as monotonous gameplay with not a whole lot happening. This is very much a, like, personal opinion category. If everyone is, like, continually missing their attacks, then you could absolutely just view that as the game state isn't really advancing, so to say, as when no one's taking damage, nothing is happening. So that could be viewed as both bad for enjoyability and depth. So abusing terrain to minimize enemy hit rates probably isn't, like, that good for overall excitement factor. This one, genuinely does just feel like an opinion. Like, enjoyability for the most part, I feel like can be objective, but for an early game chapter that's just so simplistic, it's really just gonna come down to personal bias. And for me personally, I'm gonna go ahead and take the cop-out path and say each to their own, with my own being that I do personally enjoy this chapter. Due to the previously mentioned fort abuse, and also, like, getting a unit onto the fort on the left on turn 1 using a rescue drop strat is, like, genuinely a satisfying little puzzle to solve. Like, having to realize is like, oh, I actually can drop, like, a cav onto the fort immediately as long as I deal with a soldier on the right. And then I can have markers on the fort if I rescue him with boars and blah, 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 blah. And it makes, like, the cogs in your brain tick. It makes it all, like, whir really nicely. It's a nice way to introduce you to rescue dropping as well. It's good stuff! This chapter's good, I like it! So, I say if you like seeing miss over and over again, and you like solving, like, terrain puzzles with how do I get Marcus onto this fort on turn 1, there's gotta be a way. If you like stuff like that, I think this chapter really does succeed at enjoyability. Maybe not really, succeeds at enjoyability, but I think it's riveting and entertainment. Gets a pass from me, Chief. And that will wrap it up for this week's episode, which may be a bit shorter than normal, but I think that's completely fair, given that this chapter is rather simple. They're not all going to be, like, massive, sprawling chapters with, like, oodles and oodles of things to talk about. Sometimes they're just very, very simple. Like I said, you kind of need a different mindset to talk about early game chapters, and I think this one mostly succeeds at what it sets out to do, teaching the player what it can expect from Binding Blade, as well as offering a rather well done tutorial about forts. What can I say? I like forts. I think they're neat. It's not the most glamorous or a particularly, like, exciting chapter, but I think it's a pretty, as I said, neat chapter that's pretty underrated in the grand scheme of things. Now, as for our anagram, this one is going to be very, very awkward, as these titles keep getting shorter and shorter, and there's only so many words you can make with 6 letters. So I imagine you'll solve this one pretty much as soon as you see it. But don't let it spoil the fun. The anagram for our next episode is none other than Dex Ran. For those in the back, hope you're listening, Dex Ran. Alright, that's all from me this week. Hope you guys enjoyed. I will catch you guys next time. Have a great one, everyone. I will see you next week.